The Margins of City Life by John Merriman. I wanted to read something written by this John Merriman. And just from his storytelling, like, he'll always give an aside during his lectures and then say, well, it's an aside, but it's a telling aside. And he talked about how he had met an old woman in a village who said that, oh yeah, right up there's where they hung my husband after the German, like during the German occupation. Oh, and him talking about how for industrialization and the techniques of painting plates picked up, and he's like, in Limoges before 1886, Renoir started out painting plates, and if you have a Limoges plate from 1886 or before 1886, you hang on to those babies and you don't put them in the microwave. In his book, it's really focusing on the outsider regions of, like, the outsiders. Yeah, and during this time, like, the way that Paris annexed a lot of the suburbs that surrounded it, it's remained to this day, and he talks about that. It was not by coincidence that the peripheral communes of the near suburbs of Paris were annexed as of January 1st, 1860. Montmartre, Belleville, Vaugirard, and Grenelle, rapidly growing yet retaining much of their rural character, were among the 12 communes pulled into Paris as state and city extended the octroi. They formed part of newly reorganized arrondissements that have lasted to this day. There's these weird-looking peasants being like, oh, now we're part of Paris. It's a Daumier lithograph. Just showing that simple, more rural characters were being, annexed into Paris, and had the majority of the wealthy people living in the center of Paris, and the poorer working class folk lived in the faubourg, or the outside regions, the outer regions. Really, because he talks about the octroi, or the customs barrier that was in place, where you'd basically have to pay a tax on anything coming in through the octroi, so that factories would move on the outskirts, so like outside of the octroi, so they could avoid paying for the things they were bringing in. And he describes that a lot of the outer folk were resented and at times feared. It became, after a while, that it wasn't just, strange kind of shifty characters like prostitutes or beggars or brigandage is the word that they use, and that was kind of on the outskirts, but it became that really to the wealthy people living in the center in Paris were fearing the working class people of the suburbs, that if they organize, they'll be the cord that wrings our neck someday. So he talks about the faubourg, Faubourg. He says, Hugo described the circumference of the center. It was not the country, it was not the town. The place where a plain makes its junction with a town is always imprinted with a species of penetrating melancholy. Balzac, too, Chevalier notes, was anxious about the ongoing changes in the peripheral landscape, for here it is no longer Paris, and here it is still Paris. The association of the faubourg of Paris with poverty, immorality, and vice goes back a long way. Despite the difficulties of accurately establishing the social geography of poverty, It is known that in the 14th and 15th centuries, the northern fringe along the ramparts was suspect. Generally speaking, wealth was allocated concentrically. The periphery seemed poorer, while the center, the nucleus, groups bourgeois of means. Then on 61, the peripheral faubourg had emerged as a central figure in the discourse of fear and rebellion before the Revolution. Stephen Kaplan's study of the false workers, faux ouvriers, of the faubourg of Saint-Antoine in Paris during the 18th century offers an excellent case in point of what we mean here by the floating worlds of the periphery. In that faubourg lived the usurpers, workers without skill, working without limit or discipline, living in the neighborhood beyond the Bastille that became identified with revolutionary disorder. Their illegal work and lower wage demands challenged the monopoly of the recognized corporation. There, benefiting from the size and complexity of the neighborhood and from the complicity of those who profited from their work or shared their status as outsiders, these false workers created a world of parallel work, outside the communities of craft, perceived of as socially illicit, politically seditious, morally corrupt, and technically incapable. In the opinion of those who tried to control and impose order on them, they were little more than vagabonds who, looking in the faubourg for shelter first and then a job, successfully resisted various campaigns by the corporation and the state to break their defiance. Even the extent of the faubourg seemed alarming, sort of an interminable frontier, infinitely extendable, which seems to rise up against Paris to destroy, in the end, the city itself. And really that the power of the workers is becoming known to them. The insurrection of the Lyons silk workers in 1834 may have given the workers of Reims, some of whom donned red caps, a sense of common national struggle against the manufacturers. 2 strikes by woolen workers took place that year, followed by smaller movements in 1837 and 1841. The strikes of 1834 reflected occupational or craft consciousness, and perhaps even some degree of generalized class consciousness too, as spinners resisted wage cuts and mechanization. Spinners paraded through the streets, singing a song to the tune of Marseillaise. Onward, spinners, take courage, the hour of vengeance has arrived. Break the chains of slavery from which we want to free ourselves. Stand up, working class. With honor we'll follow the path. We must smash the big looms, leave nothing but dust. It is no coincidence that all the examples of charivaris, noisy mock serenades, the rough music provided by banging on pots and pans, directed at people accused of violating communal norms or traditions, came from the faubourg. And then on 25, increasingly organized workers seemed a far greater threat to the economic, social, and political order than the dangerous classes. No one was more aware of this than the police. By the Second Empire, as Jean Gaillard has written, the fear of the faubourg replaced the fear of the sick quarters of the center. The marginaux gradually emerged as contenders for political power. Like the Limousin, Cantalou, and Vosgien, who formed the urban villages in Paris, the marginal person represented an urban experience far more stable than that predicted by the various uprooting hypotheses considering the social effects of migration, and thus of social and physical marginality. General Haussmann, who helped rebuild Paris in a way that would hopefully, bring more airflow to these dank, crowded streets, but mainly he also wanted to prevent any uprisings or ways to build barricades. So he built these big boulevards, so large that you could apparently not build any type of barricade to be used in an uprising. And these boulevards that Haussmann was responsible for building in Paris, and believe John Merriman has described it like the imperialism of the straight line. But it says boulevards had plowed through some old working class neighborhoods, among them that of the Rue Tranonien on the edge of the Marais, a street identified in the collective memory with the massacre of workers by the Bourgeois National Guard in 1834. Haussmann pulled no punches in his memoir, specifically associating the street with the insurgency. A contemporary observed in 1863, the transformation of Paris, having forcibly removed the working population from the center toward the extremities, has made two cities of the capital, one rich, one poor. The deprived classes form an immense cordon around the well-off. In 1870, another declared, the flood of poverty rose in Belleville, while the river of luxury flowed at full crest in the new quarters of Paris. Yeah, so a lot of the faubourgs were these sort of outer areas where they were a community, but they were usually less policed, and they were kind of making, the wealthy people were kind of making fun of the faubouriens, the people who lived out there. Faubourg came to house some of the poorest of the poor. Faubourg and suburb were places of residence for generally unskilled laborers, recently arrived and or unable to afford the higher prices of the center. Generally speaking, the farther away from the urban center one went, the less expensive land became. Essential commodities too became cheaper, a fact to be accounted for in no small measure by the placement of the octroi on the formal limits of the city. Oh yeah, here's where he describes how a lot of the protests involve song. And this is in Perpignan. Revolution and singing went hand in hand in the Second Republic. Songs sparked many of the fights between the Rouge and Blanc of the two warring neighborhoods, the Reds and the Whites. In 1850, few days went by without brawls and other incidents. Thus, on May 20th, after a group of military replacements had marched down the Rue de la Jontière, singing and shouting for the Republic, confrontations occurred in Saint-Jacques. The research that John Merriman puts into this book, you can just feel it as you read it. Like, he knows, this guy, how does he know every little part and piece of France? But definitely when you read this, there's so many different French towns and names where I had to go on like Google to be like, how the hell do you say this? How do you pronounce this? Like Caen is Caen, and then there was Rouen, which is just Rouen. And I mean, I took French for like 8 years of elementary school, and I remember Dis-moi-tout, and just the contrast of how American cities are structured completely different, in the sense that the American cities usually have poorer people living in the city, and the richer, wealthier suburbs, and it's completely different for in the French case. And they were looked at as professional strangers, these like nomadic people that just wanted to kind of were interested in finding work in the factories, or they were really poor. But it says professional strangers such as common laborers, prostitutes, beggars, and vagabonds no longer seemed as threatening, whereas organized industrial workers were now thought to be the cord that will strangle us one day. Page 230. The images of the drunken commoner and the cord that will strangle us one day merged. The problem was simple. In the environs of Paris, the working class is very numerous, even too numerous, came a report to the Minister of Justice at the end of October 1851, little more than a month before Louis Napoleon's coup d'etat. On November 25, 1851, the authorities of the communes, through which the railway to the north passed, including Maison-sur-Seine, were put on a special alert, presumably in anticipation of the coup d'etat. You also learn about the ganguettes, Guingettes, which are these little kind of taverns to drink in. Anjouville offered not only cheaper lodgings, but numerous ganguettes. There and in Greville, one could hardly avoid small cabarets and shady places of all kinds, where prostitutes hang out to escape our surveillance. Many of them lived in an infinity of rough huts on the slope along the moat beyond the fortifications. Most of them worked in the Le Havre, many managing to avoid not only police controls but the regular medical inspections, thus spreading venereal disease among sailors, soldiers, and civilians alike. I love John Merriman. I'm so glad I was able to read one of his books. In his preface, basically, this is him after he misses a train home, or misses a bus home at night. So he says, after a while I came upon a green and white bus parked on a wide street. The bus was evidently out of service. In those days no buses ran at night in the suburbs, or even in Paris itself. But inside the bus was a bus driver in uniform and cap, sitting in the driver's seat reading. I still do not know why he was there, perhaps a family problem. In any case, he seemed perfectly content to be reading. I walked up to the driver's window and asked him if the bus was in service. He replied, logically enough and a little scornfully, "Of course not." Then I asked him if he could tell me how to get to Le Perrot. It was a good distance, he said, and pointed me in the right direction. I then set off along the right road, running. About 5 minutes later, hearing a horn beep, I looked back to see a bus, the same bus, looming just behind me. "Montez, chef," said the driver. He then asked where I was going in Le Perrot and drove me there, having to back up to make the turn in the right direction on the boulevard d'Alsace-Lorraine. He took me right to the door. I didn't know how to thank him and, perhaps a little deadened by bad wine, hesitantly began to take a bus ticket out of my pocket as if to cancel it. The driver laughed. A ticket wasn't necessary. I thanked him. He drove off, probably to continue reading somewhere. As in most of France, the suburbs had proved very welcoming indeed.